dedicated multi-view output. So that is a little bit different than what you're maybe used to if you're coming from the A10 mini series, where you had an output that you had to select multi-view output. So that is all your various sources, including what you may be used to if you're coming from the A10 mini series. Still are going to need a dedicated computer and in order to do coding if you want to go that route. Personally, still are going with a piece of hardware, a dedicated computer, less and more reliable than running software code. If you want to go that route, is there if you want. To view all of those. In addition, the other thing that this one is MADI input, and a single MADI input and two MADI outputs. And the MADI protocol that in addition, the other thing that this one allows is MADI digital audio, MADI input, two MADI outputs. MADI protocol that in MADI output. The output allows you to extract the audio from all of your various sources, MADI inputs, video, MADI outputs, MADI protocol, MADI addition, then run into a switch allows you to extract the audio from all of your various sources, MADI inputs, run MADI outputs, MADI audio, MADI addition, this one would be run into a switch allows you to extract the audio from all of your various sources, MADI inputs, MADI audio, MADI addition, this one would be run into a switch allows you to extract the audio from all of your various sources, MADI inputs, MADI audio, MADI addition, this one would be run into a switch allows you to extract the audio. This one losing your ability to do streaming, you're going to be losing your ability to record video directly on the device. As I mentioned several times on this on this video. The other thing I'd worth to mention is that Super Source, if you have an A10 Mini Extreme, is available only on the higher two models of this switcher. So it's not available on the 1ME model. So even though the Mini Extreme is basically priced the same as the 1ME Constellation HD, the Constellation does not have the Super Source feature that's available in the Mini Extreme. So you'd be losing that as well. So it's very much 2 steps forward, 1 step back in terms of new products that Blackmagic has announced. If you're used to using some of those features that are available on some of those A10 Mini models, and you want to move up to something that's a little higher end, well, you're going to be losing a few features in the process. Not that I can blame Blackmagic for doing so. Those features are some that you typically find people who are working professionally in video production are going to want to do separately anyway. So even if these devices included recording and streaming, most people wouldn't be using that if they're working in this sort of a workflow. All right, so something else that's definitely worth mentioning, and I neglected here at the beginning of this video, like all of these include scalers and frame rate converters on all inputs, and so it doesn't matter what your video source is, as long as it's 720p or 1080 at up to 60 frames per second, these devices will accept that and convert it to whatever video you happen to be inside this, which is pretty awesome. It makes it much easier to convert devices, whereas some of their previous switchers would force you to make sure that all of your inputs conform to the same format. These will actually do the conversion for you. Although having said that, I would highly encourage you to sure that you're setting the devices to the same format. Otherwise, you can get some strange format conversion artifacts. For example, converting from 24 frames per second to 30 frames per second, motion just becomes very unnatural and odd. So it still would be better if you take the time to adjust your video sources to use the same format as the switcher instead of relying on those internal converters. But those internal converters are there for those times when you can't, or you've got a device that refuses to cooperate, Max, in order to make sure that you're able to get your video sources into your switcher. The other thing that's going to be very different compared to some of their previous models is the generic outputs. So instead of having your dedicated program, preview, etc. outputs, these use generic outputs that you can assign to any video source, which is great. It allows you some flexibility, but it's going to be a little bit of an adjustment for people who are used to working with dedicated hardware outputs for specific purposes. Now, in terms of pricing and availability, these switchers are allegedly shipping now, so it means you should be able to order them with your favorite video source, video equipment reseller very quickly. Pricing, the 1ME model starts at $995, the 2ME model starts at $1,695, and the 4ME model starts at $3,695, so just under $3,700. Again, it should be available now. In terms of well, very cool. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I mean, I'm personally looking for an upgrade for my older 2ME 4K model. I shoot in 4K as I'm doing this video quite a bit, and they've not addressed the 4K model just yet is a little bit disappointing to me. I'm hoping they come up with something a little bit later, then I'm not forced to move to their $10,000 Constellation model. But for anybody who's doing an HD workflow and wants a higher end model, these things are going to be great. You know, these things offer a lot of flexibility, a lot of capabilities in a very small unit. You get built-in scalers, you get advanced chroma keyers, you get advanced audio, which are things that we have not had available in any of their rack mount models other than the Constellation up until now. So this is a big upgrade for people who are able to stay within an HD workflow. But if you're wanting to shoot 4K, these are not the switchers you're looking for. So just keep that in mind as you're making your purchasing decisions, that 4K, if it's in your immediate or relatively future plans, these are probably not the switchers that you want to be getting. But anyway, so this is exciting, but at the same time, kind of a little bit disappointing. And some things that we hoped, like 4K and live streaming and recording of video sources directly from the switchers. So that's going to about do it for now. So if you have questions about this, please let me know in the comments very soon. I'm going to be heading to NAB here in just a few minutes. I'll be on the show floor tomorrow morning, and I'll be able to spend a little bit of time with these in person, playing with them and becoming more familiar with them. So if there's something you want me to check, or if there's something you want me to ask the Blackmagic staff there, please let me know in the comments down below, and I will do my best to find out for you. So that's going to do it for now. So thanks everybody for watching, and have a fantastic day.
Elektryczny napęd, intuicyjne technologie, design coupé. Ma wszystko, czego szukam.
Volkswagen ID.5. Poczuj ekscytującą harmonię, płynącą z połączenia z technologią. Umów się na jazdę próbną.
Oh, HDMI. One of those things we love to hate. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are stuck with it. So today I wanted to talk about some options for running HDMI signals over a longer distance than you might typically be able to do. So those who aren't already familiar, HDMI cables, well, HDMI was never designed to run for very far, so getting it to run more than about, I don't know, 8 meters, maybe 10 meters, you kind of have to do some special things in order to make it work. And when we're doing video, live video, we need to be able to extend the distance that we're running an HDMI signal from a camera to switcher. So in this case, I'm using my A10 Mini Extreme and the Canon EOS RP camera, but fill in whatever other models you happen to want to use. So any of the A10 Minis or like Panasonic GH5, whatever. Any camera has an HDMI output, any switcher has an HDMI input. If we need to run signals over distance, there's some things that we need to do in order to make that become nice and reliable. So I've got a few options here, and I'll go over each one of those and tell you about some of the pros and cons of each. Alright, so first option I want to talk about is just getting a long HDMI cable, and this is probably the most obvious solution, right? So it's the first thing that everybody tries, and sometimes works and sometimes it doesn't. It depends on how far you're going, and it also depends on the equipment you're using. So some cameras, for example, output a more robust signal than others, and some receiving devices like a switcher do a better job of handling a weak signal than others. Along with that, the quality of the cable is kind of all over the map as well. So you might get a cable that looks nice and thick and heavy duty, and you find out that it's terrible and it doesn't work very well. So you can't tell by the reviews necessarily, but you need something that's going to work for you. So end up buying multiple different cables, trying them out. Sometimes you find out that some of those cables don't even work for very long. They might work initially, but after inserting and removing a few times, they've been coiled and uncoiled a few times, they're just no longer reliable. You get signal dropout and all sorts of problems like that. So I would only go with a long HDMI cable if you're running for a distance of less than about 8 meters. Even that might be too much with some equipment, but that's kind of where I found the longest that I can run HDMI and have it be at least somewhat reliable without any sort of converting to another signal type or a booster or something along the way in order to repeat the signal and make it stronger. So yeah, so if you're tempted to just get a really long HDMI cable, I wouldn't do it if you're gonna have to run the signal more than, I don't know, 6 to 8 meters. Maybe 10 meters on the long side. I've heard people that have been able to get more than that, but in my own experience, I've never been able to get those kind of lengths to just be 100% reliable. So if you want something that's going to last for you after repeated inserting and removing and coiling and uncoiling and possible dirt and everything, you probably don't want to go anything more than about 8 meters on those. Alright, say that you need to go just a little bit farther than what you can get with just a single HDMI cable. There's a pretty inexpensive way you can get a little bit of additional distance on top of that, and that is to use an HDMI splitter. So this is more sophisticated than you would need. This is a 4-way, but basically you take the output of your camera, run that into the input of an HDMI splitter, and run the output of your splitter into a switcher. And what that's doing is regenerating the signal. So this splitter is basically recreating that signal. So it reads what's coming from the camera, creates a brand new signal with the same data, and sends that out the HDMI port, and that's what's going to your switcher. So basically, by regenerating the signal, you're able to extend the distance that you can run and give yourself a little more length of cable that you can use in order to extend this just that little bit more. I wouldn't use this method for trying to run more than about 2 cables. You got to power these things along the way, and it's not a 100% robust solution. So yeah, I wouldn't do this on a normal basis, but if you have the occasional situation where you need just a little bit of extra distance, a splitter can get that for you. Similarly, there are HDMI extenders that do basically the same thing. And they unfortunately tend to be a little more expensive than splitters because they're a more specialty product, and it's not something we necessarily have laying around, whereas those of us who work with HDMI probably have a splitter somewhere that we can throw into run up a cable if we need to. The next most sophisticated solution that I can recommend is going to be getting an HDMI optical cable. Now, what the heck is that? I mean, HDMI is an electrical signal. What are we talking about? So, essentially what's going on is inside this cable, along with a handful of copper wires to help send power and a few other unsophisticated signals, basic signals, these actually have a fiber optic, at least one strand, fiber optic cable inside of it in order to send the signals. Optical signals are able to travel a lot farther than electrical signals. So by switching the signal to optical rather than something that's being run over copper, we're getting a signal that's a lot more robust and be able to travel a lot farther. One of the downsides of these cables, though, is they can be a little bit expensive. This is a 50-foot cable, and it was $106. So you're paying a lot more for one of these than you would a standard HDMI cable, but sometimes you need the extra distance. These cables are directional, so in this case it's labeled source and display. And so in order to use these, you have to make sure you get things plugged in the right direction. So for example, if I want to plug it into this camera, I'm going to have to use an HDMI coupler here, and then I plug in the source into the camera and plug the display into the input on the switcher. It has to be running that direction. If you try and reverse it and connect things up the other way, it's not going to work. So you have to be careful when you're setting up, make sure you spool out the cable in the right direction. These are not 100% all the time. I have had situations, certain types of equipment where they just don't work. For example, the most common one I've run into is running a computer, a laptop or whatever, to a monitor. I had numerous situations I was testing this where that just didn't work. I had better luck with cameras, so as I tested a few cameras with this situation, it actually worked fairly well. And if you take a peek here, you can see that the video from my camera is going through this cable and making it into my ATEM switcher. One of the other pros of doing this is it doesn't require any outside power. This cable, even though it does require power, is receiving it from the connected devices, so it's either getting the power from the camera or the switcher or some combination of both in order to do that conversion from electrical to optical. So devices you're plugging in have to supply a little bit of power. It isn't much, but they have to supply a little bit of power in order for this. So besides being kind of expensive and directional, and not working with every device, this is a pretty good solution that can work in a lot of different situations. The next couple are going to be ways where we can send video over Cat5 or Cat6 cable, basically Ethernet cable, that type of same type of cable you use for doing a computer network. We've got a number of options that make that possible as well. What I have here is a pair of HDMI extenders. These particular ones are from Oray, but there's any number of brands that are out there that can work very, very well. So the way these work is I'll start with the sender. So this is basically the transmitter. So you have your HDMI coming from your camera. Plug that into your HDMI input on the extender. And you plug in your Cat5 cable on one end, and then on the other end, you'll essentially do the opposite. You have your Cat5 cable coming in, an HDMI out that you'll run to an HDMI input on or whatever, and then supply power for that, and you're good to go. So these are able to work at much longer distances than a lot of the other options out there. So this particular pair of devices here is rated for about 400 feet, so a little bit over 100 meters, and they work pretty well. So these devices don't change the signal in any kind of way other than being converted to something that can run over Cat5, so you're not losing any quality by going this route. The only real downside to this is that these can be a little bit expensive, cheaper than some of the other options out there, and then you have to supply power on both ends. So this can be a decent option if you need to run an HDMI signal over a long distance. Alright, I've got another one here that uses Cat5. This is a little bit different in that it actually uses IP computer network protocol in order to send a video signal from one end to the other. So, whereas the previous extenders that we looked at used their own proprietary format for sending the signal over the cable, this actually uses IP networks. In this case, I believe it's UDP in order to send the video from one end to the other. These are similar in concept to the extender, but you have some differences there as well. So in this case, it also has a USB port for if you need to hook up a monitor, or sorry, hook up a keyboard or a mouse or whatever. You can do that. However, there are some downsides, and as I was testing these, and I got from a couple different manufacturers, as I was testing these, I found that the data that's being sent by these devices completely saturate a computer network. So even though it's using IP, you're not able to have this be on the same network as anything else, and it doesn't matter whether it's a switch network or whatever. The VLAN, even VLANs, I had trouble with when I was playing with this. So it generates so much data that it overwhelms any network that it's connected to. So I would really only consider these if you're able to control the flow of the signals from one end to the other and it's not going through any network switches that are being used for anything else. So the other downside to these is they do reduce the video quality and they do introduce some delay. So I would really consider these only use them if you have to kind of solution. I found that they were not really reliable and robust enough in order to produce a high quality signal and for it to always work no matter what. So I would probably steer clear of this kind of solution for doing long distance HDMI runs. That brings us to our last one that I wanted to talk about today, and that is to convert the signals to SDI and run the signal over BNC coax cable. Or if you need to run video in a building that has coax run, so like cable TV lines, those kinds of things, those can actually send an SDI signal, usually just fine without any real issues. In order to do this, you'll have to have converters at both ends. So the side of the camera, you're going to have an HDMI to SDI converter, and then the other end, you're going to have an SDI to HDMI converter in order to convert it back for the format that the switcher happens to need. So, and then between there, you can have cable up to about 100 meters, maybe a little more, depending on the quality of your cable, but a lot farther than you can run HDMI, that's for sure. So, and if you needed to go farther than that, you can actually use one of these SDI to HDMI converters in order to repeat the signal, sort of like we did with the splitter with the HDMI a little bit ago. So, it can actually be a really good solution if you need to interface hardware that has SDI connections in the way. Once you get anything and then like the A10 Mini Extreme here, you're going to be getting into switchers that use SDI natively. SDI is the preferred format for video in professional work. So if you might be working with somebody else who's running a video production company, you can almost be sure that they're going to be running SDI to interface with them. These are great to have on hand just for that purpose, right? Just that purpose alone. But it's always a great way to get a signal to run a cable. It's very inexpensive. You can pick this up at a hardware store and make it your own length very easily, much the same like you can with Cat5 as well. But the hardware to do the conversion for this is actually a little bit cheaper than some of the other options that we've seen here. Generally speaking, this would be my preferred option of the ones we've talked about here if I need to run signals from very far. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that I do run a lot of devices that use SDI, so it's great to be able to interface with those natively without having to convert from yet another obscure format. I should definitely mention to those of you who are using Blackmagic equipment, so A10 Mini, A10 Mini Extreme, A10 Mini Pro, whatever, along with Blackmagic cameras, and you're using the camera control features, that several of these solutions won't work to control the camera over a distance. So of those that I've shown, the HDMI splitter may or may not work. That's just going to be hit and miss. The HDMI fiber optic cable will probably work, but there's no actual guarantees. The HDMI extender again, that one probably will not, though there may be exceptions to that. And the IP-based will definitely not work. That one's not going to support the necessary protocols in order to make that happen. And the SDI solution will work if you run cables and use a pair of these bidirectional 3G converters. You have to run cables in both directions because the signals being used to control the cameras are being sent from the switcher to the camera, and with just a single SDI cable, you're only getting signals in one direction from camera to switcher. So you have to add a cable in order to get that return signal as well. And again, you have to have one of these bidirectional converters at both ends. So probably not the ideal to do that everywhere and get more converters, but you can do it if you need to. You can do it in a pinch. So yeah, just if you're in that situation where you have pocket cinema camera and HM switcher and you need the camera control features, coloring, play, stop, recording features, those kind of things, you do have to take some additional steps in order to make sure that those are going to work as well.